You're being manipulated by invisible forces that prefer you remain asleep. Behind daily distractions, constant entertainment, and carefully curated news lies a disturbing truth. Social, political, and economic elites are deeply invested in keeping you exactly where you are, alienated, uninformed, and spiritually dormant. These forces know your spiritual awakening poses a direct threat to their silent domination. They fully understand that the more you question your reality, the harder you become to control. Thus, they heavily invest not only in controlling media and production, but also in shaping your thoughts and feelings about yourself and the world around you. The knowledge of your true divine and creative potential is the elites' most closely guarded secret. They tremble at the thought of you discovering who you truly are, because it would spell the total collapse of the power hierarchy they have maintained for centuries. The real battle isn't just political or economic, it's spiritual, and you're at the heart of it. There's a silent, deeply rooted belief that dominates almost all human actions, thoughts, and choices. The idea of a central, continuous, solid self, as someone who lives life. This belief, so natural and never questioned, is the foundation upon which dreams, fears, achievements, pains, desires, and failures are built. But what if all of this were an illusion? What if, in reality, this self was just a thought, a narrative, an empty reflection repeated over the years like a blind mantra? The mind fears this possibility like it fears death. Because if the self doesn't exist, what remains? What's left when all identifications, name, history, social role, memories, hopes are seen as passing clouds? This isn't about some philosophical theory or abstract spiritual concept. This is about something direct, immediate, and visceral, the deconstruction of what sustains all personal experience. For centuries, religions, spiritual traditions, and esoteric systems have pointed in this same direction, but almost always in veiled, symbolic ways, disguised under dogmas and rituals. However, there are teachings that dare to speak the truth without beating around the bush. The self isn't real. And it's precisely this statement that becomes the starting point of this journey. Not a proposal to be accepted or rejected, but an invitation to investigate. The inner voice that thinks itself someone is just a thought that learned to repeat itself. The child who looked at the world for the first time didn't know what I was. This construction was taught, named, reinforced, and today governs life. But something is still there, silent before all this learning. A presence that doesn't need a name, a consciousness that simply is. It's in this abyss of questioning that the journey begins. Not with promises of enlightenment, nor with solutions to improve the ego, but with an explosion. The revelation that the person you think you are never existed as reality. Suffering, attachments, fears, they all revolve around this false identity. Modern spiritual searching often boils down to memorizing ideas, repeating pretty phrases, or collecting experiences. But none of this touches the essential. The proposal is radical: abandon everything, not through denial but through recognition. The false must fall so the real can be seen. The path proposes that you observe, question, look within without looking away. When you ask, "Who am I?" you're not seeking an answer. You're seeking the end of all answers. Because what we are cannot be spoken, only lived. And that's why this journey has no heroes, no gurus, no miracles. It only has the deconstruction of humanity's greatest myth, the myth of the self. The camera turns to emptiness. And in the center of that emptiness, a question echoes. If you're not who you think you are, then who are you? It all starts with a name, a sound attributed to a body, repeated with affection or demands, until it becomes synonymous with existence. With the name come the story, the praise, the scolding, the achievements, the mistakes. And with time, the most convincing illusion of all emerges. I am this. Identity is molded not from an essence, but from the reactions the world offers to the name, the appearance, the performance. This construction is so integrated into daily life that its validity is rarely questioned. But the great lie is born here. The personal self is a collage of experiences, memories, and beliefs, not a real entity. This entity, so adored and protected, is actually a mental process, a sensation of continuity between thoughts, an illusory thread that connects the past to the present and projects the future. This self is the point of origin of all human suffering, and not because it suffers, but because it is the suffering. It's the fear of rejection, the anxiety for control, the attachment to personal image. Everything revolves around this idea of someone who needs to be preserved at any cost. The personal self is a broken finger. Anything it touches hurts, not because life is painful in itself, but because experience is being filtered through an artificial identity that reacts to everything as if everything were a threat. This pain isn't a flaw in existence, but an inevitable consequence of living through a distorted lens. From early on, we're taught that we should be someone, and that someone is defined by external criteria: success, appearance, intelligence, behavior. No one is encouraged to discover who they are without these layers. Identity becomes a comfortable prison, decorated with goals, memories, and narratives. But just one unexpected event, a loss, a failure, an existential crisis, is enough for this construction to start trembling. And what remains when it collapses? What's left when everything believed to be me shows itself as fragile and temporary? The personal self is a reference point, but it's not fixed. It changes with mood, with age, with circumstances. Yet we insist on treating it as something solid. The contradiction is clear. If what we call self is in constant mutation, how can it be real? And if it's not real, why is so much energy dedicated to defending it, promoting it, and protecting it? This is where provocation becomes investigation. Instead of trying to improve the self, as common self-help practices do, see if it really exists, not as a theory, but as direct observation. Who is this one who suffers? Who is this one who thinks, feels, and reacts? Is there really a fixed entity behind all this, or just a flow of perceptions without an author? Most people built their house inside the notion of a personal self, and because of that, they're doomed to suffering. Because this house has no foundation, it's made of floating thoughts and fickle feelings. Any wind of change causes collapse, but instead of leaving this fragile structure, they try to reinforce it with more beliefs, more memories, more narratives, and the cycle continues. The great lie, then, isn't that suffering exists. The lie is that there's someone suffering. What there is are sensations, thoughts, and experiences, but the mind constructs an owner for these experiences, a central sufferer. This owner, this center, is the illusory self. And as long as it's treated as real, pain will continue to recycle itself. The proposed path isn't about denying emotions, but about seeing that they don't have a fixed self to whom they belong. When it's recognized that the self is just an idea sustained by repetition, something begins to change. The energy previously used to protect this identity begins to dissolve, and in that space, a new silence emerges, an openness, something that doesn't need to be defined, defended, or explained. It just is. The great lie, therefore, is also the great opportunity, because by unmasking the false, the true is revealed, and the truth cannot be named or possessed. It doesn't suffer, doesn't desire, has no fear. It just observes, witnesses, and exists. At this point, a question hovers in the air, a question that doesn't seek an answer, but presence. If the self is an illusion, what remains when it goes away? A question rises in the heart of silence. Who am I? Not as a philosophical search, nor as existential curiosity, but as a blade that cuts all assumptions. This question, so simple and direct, has the power to shake the foundations of everything believed to be real. It doesn't ask for answers, it destroys them all. Self-inquiry isn't an intellectual method. It's not about thinking better or organizing the mind. It's about turning inward and looking with an almost violent radicality at what you assume to be I. It's not about adding more information to the mind, but about stripping it completely bare, removing each layer until only the unspeakable remains. When you ask, "Who am I?" the immediate impulse is to answer with references: name, profession, life story, emotions felt, frequent thoughts. But none of these answers withstand the scrutiny of the question itself. The name was given, the profession changes, emotions fluctuate, thoughts are passing. What is there then that doesn't change? What is there that remains, even when all this disappears? This questioning, when done sincerely, is deeply uncomfortable. The mind resists. It tries to escape, responds with formulas, offers distractions. It fears being exposed, because deep down, the mind knows there's no one behind it, that it itself is just a set of processes, automatic, conditioned, impersonal. The inner heresy begins here, in daring to doubt the mind. Self-investigation is like a mirror in which eternity recognizes itself. It's a mirror that doesn't show forms, but reveals their absence. Whoever looks within with enough courage doesn't find a person. They find the space where all people, thoughts, and sensations appear and disappear. And that space is silent, impersonal, infinite. It's at this point that the process becomes dangerous for the ego, because it realizes there's no someone running life. Life is simply happening, being witnessed by a nameless, faceless, historyless consciousness. This doesn't mean loss of functional individuality, but rather the collapse of the illusion of a self that needs to control, plan, defend itself. The heresy here isn't against religion, it's against the greatest of dogmas, the existence of a separate self. It's the denial of the protagonist in one's own narrative, and that's why it's so shocking. Because the entire structure of personality is sustained by the idea that there's a conscious center behind each thought. The question is direct. Is there really an entity inside the body that can be called I? And this question isn't to be answered with words, but to be felt as an impact. Self-inquiry is, therefore, a silent war against illusion. And the battlefield is internal. It's a process that demands total honesty, a real desire to see the truth, even if that truth destroys everything thought to be important. Because in the end, everything that can be destroyed wasn't essential. By investigating who this I is that thinks, feels, suffers, and seeks, it's discovered that it cannot be located. It has no form, no fixed place. It's not in the body, nor in the mind, nor in emotions. It's not a thing. And when this is realized, something extraordinary happens. Suffering begins to lose support. Because there's no longer a central sufferer. There's only the flow of life being lived, without the weight of an identity to be protected. The mind, of course, tries to resist. It says this is dangerous, that it's madness. But the question remains, who's saying this? This question becomes a tool of dismantling. With each thought, emotion, fear, or doubt that arises, the same question is applied. Who's experiencing this? And following this thread, everything unravels. It becomes evident that there's no owner, only appearances in consciousness. This practice isn't comfortable. It demands that you face directly everything that was repressed, denied, or covered by the story of the self. But it's also liberating, because it reveals that peace isn't in controlling the mind, but in seeing that you're not the mind. That freedom isn't in having power over emotions, but in not being defined by them. Self-inquiry is like turning on a light in a room that's always been dark. At first, the ego's eyes hurt. But with time, what was confusing reveals itself with clarity. And in that clarity, something dissolves. Not because it was rejected, but because it was understood as illusory. At the end of this process, which isn't linear or mechanical, what remains is a silent space. A knowing without form. A presence that doesn't need a name. This presence cannot be taught or described, but it can be recognized, and once recognized, it's never forgotten. The inner heresy is, therefore, the greatest act of spiritual courage. It's not believing in something new, it's doubting everything that's been believed until now. It's letting the false fall so the real can shine. And in that light, all questions cease, because the one who was asking is no longer there. When the question, "Who am I?" is asked with depth, penetrating the veil of mental answers, there's a moment when words fail. Thoughts no longer know what to offer. Feelings can't explain. The mind, once so active and full of certainties, begins to lose ground. And then, silence approaches. But this silence isn't merely the absence of noise. It's a living, dense presence, prior to anything that can be described. It's not the silence between two thoughts, it's the space that allows thoughts to appear. It's the basis of everything, but can't be touched by anything. This is silence beyond silence. And it's precisely in this space that the illusion of ego begins to die. The dissolution process of the self doesn't end in pretty words or profound reflections. It ends in silence. A silence that isn't chosen, but that invades. You don't decide for it. It takes everything. When the mind has nothing more to say, when the body quiets, and even the impulse to seek disappears, then something is revealed. A piece that wasn't created, but that was always there, covered by mental noise and emotional tensions. In this silence, everything that seemed urgent loses meaning. Personal conflicts, spiritual desires, existential doubts, everything is seen as passing movements without power to touch what really is. There's no longer the eye trying to reach something. What remains is pure presence. And this presence makes no effort, seeks no answers, desires no understanding. It simply is. At this point, not even the question, "Who am I?" has value anymore, because the one who was asking is no longer present. The one who felt separate, confused, or lost disappears like mist in the sun. And what's left isn't a new identity, but the absence of any identity. It's the recognition that there was never separation between being and existing. The invasion of silence isn't an extraordinary experience in the common sense. There are no lights, visions, or mystical sensations. The extraordinary is in the radical simplicity of what's revealed. Nothing needs to be added. On the contrary, everything unnecessary goes away. The mind collapses not as destruction, but as surrender. It realizes it can't capture what's eternal. And finally, it quiets down. It's in this silence that consciousness recognizes itself, without mirror, without thought, without effort. It sees that it's not anywhere, but everywhere. That it's not a thing, nor a place, nor a subject, but the absolute background of all experience. There's no longer separation between observer and observed. Everything is seen as expression of the same indivisible reality. This state can't be forced. Any attempt to reach it comes from the mind, and the mind can't get there. The instruction is clear. You must abandon everything, including the desire to reach, including the idea that there's someone who can do this. When even the seeker disappears, silence appears as what always was, being itself. This experience, described by mystics of all traditions, receives various names: Christ consciousness, Buddha nature, I am, pure being. But all these names point to the same silence, a silence that can't be understood, as it's beyond understanding. There's no one to experience it, there's only the experiencing. This is where the ego fears losing itself completely, because silence represents its death, and it fights, trying to generate thoughts, memories, justifications. But the attentive practitioner is no longer captured. They see the movement, but don't identify. They perceive the resistance, but don't react. They allow everything to come and go, while remaining as what observes. This silence isn't passivity, it's pure vitality. It's life without narrative, it's presence without history. The mind, accustomed to labeling everything, doesn't know how to deal with this state, and so it tries to return, tries to reconstruct the I. But if attention is firmly anchored in silence, these attempts become laughable. The ego can't sustain itself where there's no belief. Stay quiet, so quiet that even you don't know you're quiet. This is the key. A state where there's no vigilance, no analysis, no identity, where even staying quiet disappears. Silence is no longer a practice, it's the natural. The body can move, speech can arise, thoughts can appear. But there's no longer identification. The root has been cut. This recognition is the apex of self-inquiry. You don't reach it through effort, but through emptying. When everything has been let go, when nothing remains to maintain, the real being reveals itself as that which was never born and can never die. This being has no name, but can be recognized in each breath, in each look, in each instant of pure presence. And it's here that the journey begins to dissolve. There's no more path, there's no more destination, there's only what always was. Silence, more intimate than breath, closer than thought, more present than any sensation. This silence is the answer that no question can reach, and in this silence, the whole world rests. There's a persistent image that inhabits the human mind, that spiritual freedom is an arduous conquest, full of renunciations, tests, and overcomings. But the truth confronts this narrative with unsettling simplicity. True freedom doesn't require effort, it requires detachment. Not the moralistic or forced kind of detachment, but a natural disappearance that happens when truth is seen. When the self dissolves, everything that depended on it also disappears. Attachments and fears aren't autonomous entities. They need a psychological center, a someone to carry them. Without this center, fears have nowhere to return, attachments have no one to seduce. This someone who suffers, who desires, who fears, never existed as a fixed reality. It's just a repeated reflection within the mind, and when investigated with honesty, it falls apart. In this process, it's not about fighting against desires or repressing emotions. The proposal isn't to reject human experience, but to see its impermanence with such clarity that it can no longer enslave. The fear of losing, the desire to have, the anxiety for control, all these movements rely on the idea that there's something to be protected. When this basis falls, the entire structure collapses. Why do you want to keep your attachments? This question, simple and direct, exposes the fragile logic behind our emotional compulsions. We want to keep attachments because we believe they define who we are. Without our likes, fears, traumas, and desires, there seems to be nothing left. But this is just another illusion fed by the ego. True identity doesn't depend on contents. It's the space where all contents arise and disappear. When this space is recognized, internal phenomena continue happening, thoughts arise, emotions come and go, sensations appear, but they no longer have an owner. They don't find anyone to react, to claim, to justify. And thus, they lose power. Fear is no longer feared. Desire is no longer followed. Attachment is no longer cultivated. Everything moves freely, without imprisoning. This freedom is radical because it doesn't require external change. Life continues with its imperfections, with its ups and downs, but the relationship with life is transformed. Before, everything was interpreted through the filter of the self, my pain, my story, my problem. Now, everything is simply seen, and this seeing by itself is healing. This point is a silent collapse. There are no fireworks, no dramatic revelations, just the natural disappearance of what was already false. The world doesn't change, but the way of perceiving it is purified. Events cease being personal. Conflicts no longer find fertile ground. The game of duality loses its appeal, and in place of all this arises a peace so simple it seems unrecognizable to the mind. The metaphor is clear. Everything that arises in you is a tourist, not a tenant. Emotions, memories, traumas, joys, all come and go. But you remain. You're not the movement, you're the space. And this space doesn't need to control, resist, or defend itself. It just observes. And in this observing, everything is dissolved. In this state, detachment isn't a virtue to be cultivated. It's the side effect of truth. By seeing there's no one to hold on, letting go happens naturally. By realizing the self was just an idea, the fears that revolved around it lose meaning, not because they were defeated, but because they have nowhere to sustain themselves. This is the point where many retreat. Because total detachment isn't what was imagined. It's not coldness, not indifference. It's surrender. An absolute surrender to what is. Without resistance, without attempt at manipulation, without effort to control what's already happening. And this is so simple that the mind doesn't know what to do with it. Remain only in the pure feeling of existing I am, this sweet and formless intuition. This state has no history, no character, no plans. It's pure being, and remaining in it isn't a practice, but an absence of practices. It's the non-doing, the non-trying. It's letting everything be as it is. When this total detachment happens, even the sense of detaching disappears. There's no longer effort, no personal recognition. Only being remains. A being so vast that nothing can be added to it, and nothing can be removed. This is true freedom, not having to be anything, not having to prove anything, not having to maintain anything. In this silence that emerges with the disappearance of ego, the beauty of existence reveals itself. A beauty that needs no justification, no embellishments. It simply shines, not because it tries, but because it is. And in this light, everything dissolves, everything detaches, everything goes, and what remains cannot be named. For centuries, truth has been sought like someone pursuing an unreachable horizon. Paths were walked, scriptures read, masters followed, techniques refined. The central idea behind this search was always the same, that there's something to be conquered, a special state to be reached, a final point where everything will finally make sense. But what if this premise is wrong? What if truth isn't at the end of the journey, but in abandoning the very idea of journey? The truth is here now. It always has been. It doesn't move, doesn't hide, doesn't change. What changes is attention, which insists on looking far away, toward the future, toward expectations. The spiritualized mind constructs a new character, the seeker, a more subtle, more evolved self, but still a character. They read, meditate, compare, judge their own progress, all based on the belief that there's a point to be reached. But realization isn't a point, it's the absence of point. It's the collapse of the idea of progress. There's no path, there's no distance, there's no other place to arrive. You already are what you seek. Truth doesn't need to be constructed, perfected, or deserved. It just needs to be recognized. And this recognition can only happen now, never in the future, because the future is a mind invention. In this recognition, everything simplifies. The search ends, not because something extraordinary was reached, but because it was seen that there was never separation between what one is and what one seeks. The mind, with its compulsion for maps and methods, doesn't understand this. It insists something needs to happen. But when you look with depth, you realize that what needs to happen is the end of this expectation. The anchor point is the pure feeling of I am, not as a mental affirmation, but as a silent perception of one's own existence. Before the name, before the story, before ideas, there's the simple fact of existing. This fact doesn't depend on thoughts. It's recognized in silence, and once perceived, reveals its unshakable nature. This presence, this I am, is sweet, formless, limitless. It's more intimate than any sensation. It's prior to time, and that's where truth reveals itself. It's not something that happens. It's what is. Everything else, emotions, thoughts, events, are like waves on the surface. But the depth of being remains untouched, always present, always available. There's no practice that leads to this state, because any practice that aims to get there assumes you're outside, and that's already an illusion. Forget everything you've read or studied. Abandon everything, let go of everything, give up everything. Not as negation, but as surrender. Like someone dropping a burden by realizing they never needed to carry it. Truth, then, isn't knowledge. It's recognition that there's nothing to know. It's the end of seeking. It's the end of the seeker. And, in this end, something emerges that can't be described, but is more real than any concept. The silence that remains is complete. There's no anxiety, no rush, no doubt. Because the someone who had anxiety and doubt is no longer present. Life continues, but tension disappears. The world still moves, but there's no longer an I trying to hold it. What's left is being. And being doesn't desire, doesn't fear, doesn't seek. It just is. Simple, motionless, complete. At this point, what's seen is that nothing needs to change for freedom to be present. Nothing needs to be added, corrected, conquered. Freedom isn't a consequence of effort. It's what reveals itself when effort stops. And this stopping isn't stagnation, it's presence. A presence so alive it needs no complement. It already is everything. Time ceases to be a factor. The past loses importance. The future becomes irrelevant. Only now remains. Not the psychological now, marked by appointments and clocks, but the eternal now, the field where everything happens, but which itself never moves. Truth, then, isn't an endpoint. It's the constant background of all experience. And perceiving it isn't an achievement, it's a permission, a surrender, a simple seeing, without filters, without hurry, without demand. There's nothing more to seek, and this is the greatest liberation there can be. Faced with everything that's been exposed, a conclusion imposes itself, not as a logical closure, but as an inevitable surrender. Truth is too simple for the mind to accept. This is the scandal. This is the shock. Everything that seemed complex, profound, reserved for mystics or enlightened ones was always available, here and now. There are no secret layers to be deciphered. There are no cosmic gates to be crossed. There's only being, naked and silent. This being doesn't need to be reached, only recognized. And precisely because of that, most resist. Because it's simple. Because it doesn't require effort, conquest, or evolution. Because it challenges everything that was taught. That you need to become someone better. That perfection is in the future. That peace depends on control. All of this is dismantled with one gesture. Abandon everything, including the idea of abandoning. This simplicity is unbearable for the ego. It needs complexity to survive. It needs drama, conflict, justifications. It needs to keep alive the idea that there's something to conquer, something to improve, something to protect. The ego feeds on the illusion of separation. And when the simplicity of truth reveals itself, it finds nowhere to hide, not because it was fought, but because it was seen. At this point, the only thing left is silence. but not a passive or dead silence, a full, pulsating, absolute silence. A silence that isn't thought, explained, or practiced. A silence that is. It can't be affected by words, emotions, or events. It's beyond what can be understood. And because of that, it's more intimate than any idea of self. The mind, with its language, tries to approach this mystery. It calls it God, consciousness, being, and love. But no name is sufficient. No description reaches. Because what was discovered isn't within language, it's before it. Before the name, before the form, before the story. And this before isn't chronological, it's existential. When everything is quiet, what remains is what always was. That which observes without getting involved, which embraces without effort, which is without needing to be someone. This state can't be conquered because it was never lost. It's the background of all experiences, the soil where everything sprouts and everything returns. The mind can call it emptiness, but the heart knows its fullness. The scandal of simplicity is that there's nothing more to be done, no ladder to climb, no spiritual battle to win. The seeker disappears. The search ends. What's left is raw, silent, clear reality. And this reality is the very nature of being. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be explained. Everything is already here. And thus, this journey closes not with a conclusion, but with an invitation. Stop. Be quiet. Forget everything. Let everything go, including the idea of letting go. Remain only as the presence you are, and see what happens. Don't believe. Don't resist. Just observe. And then, maybe something silent and eternal awakens, not as something new, but as what you always were. When all stories cease, being reveals its face, and this face has no form, no name, no time. It's everything, and it's nothing, and it's you. Just stay in silence. If you felt this video touch something deep in you, if these words found an echo in your heart, take the next step in this journey of recognition. We've developed a set of audio tools that facilitate this intimate encounter with your own essential nature. To learn more and get immediate access, click the link on screen or in the comments. And if this exploration of truth resonated with you, write in the comments, "It made sense to me,"